When we talk about the job shortages in the sector, that really suggests that this is not just a short-term phenomenon, but it could be something that's going to be quite enduring. These are the folks the sector needs to be able to recruit and retain to be able to be the workforce it needs to be for the future. And these are the folks saying that they're not enjoying their jobs. And if we don't figure out a way to solve that, it's going to ripple for a very long time.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. While there are more conversations than ever before around decent work in the nonprofit sector and the crucial need to improve working conditions for our workers, a lot more still needs to be done. Lower salaries and temporary and part-time employment are still all too common in our sector. And so it isn't surprising that a recent report from the Environics Institute, Future Skills Center, and Diversity Institute shows low job satisfaction in the nonprofit sector. This report, which explores the employment experiences of nonprofit workers, provides a snapshot of pressing issues affecting workers in the not-for-profit sector. To dive into the study's key findings, we're grateful to welcome Laura McDonough, Associate Director, Insights and Knowledge Mobilization at the Future Skills Center, and Steve Ayer, President and Founder of Common Good Strategies and author of the report. Laura and Steve, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you. We're really excited to talk about the report.
Well, we're going to get right into it. Steve, we'll start with you. Before we delve into the findings, can you tell us how this project came to be and its main objectives?
Yeah, so the report is based off of data from the Survey on Employment and Skills, which is an ongoing survey conducted by the Future Skills Center, the Diversity Institute, and the Environics Institute. And I'll leave it for Laura to get into some of the details of that. But it's a very large survey that's been conducted a bunch of different times. It's about 5,000 or 6,000 people each time. They actually asked people whether they work in the nonprofit sector, which is a very unique question to be included on the data. So we saw an opportunity to look at that data with a reasonably large sample of nonprofit workers and compare how they compare and contrast to workers in the public and private sector to see what makes the nonprofit sector unique, what makes it similar, and what are some of the major issues we can take away using that data. Laura can really dive into a bit more of the details about how the survey is conducted. And so I'll pass it to her to talk through some of the actual mechanics of the survey.
So the survey on employment and skills, this is something that we've actually done 6 times now. So we have 6 waves of this survey. The last 2 waves were done last year in March and April, and then again in October and November. So now we have more than 34,000 responses to this survey over multiple waves. And as Steven mentioned, partnership with Environics and our consortium partner, Diversity Institute. And it's really been a way for us to do a ongoing temperature check with workers across different sectors to just get a sense of how they're feeling about what's happening in Canadian workplaces. So we started it during the pandemic and have continued since, keeping some questions consistent across the different waves, as well as adding in new ones when there are sort of pressing issues like the pandemic, remote work, discrimination, that sort of thing coming up, that we can kind of tweak it every time. But now we have this opportunity, now that we've done multiple waves over the years, to be able to look across those years and start to make groupings of workers to be able to answer more specific questions, which is how the nonprofit report came about.
Our objectives with it, we're really starting just with a basic idea of like what's some of the major concerning or positive issues we can understand about how the sector works. Just because we had such a major data set with there's dozens and dozens of questions that are answered. So just the large scale of the survey gives us an opportunity to examine the sector. So it was starting not necessarily from like trying to understand job satisfaction, but instead was starting from the perspective of let's understand what some of the major issues and opportunities in the sector based on this unprecedented data set. There really has never been something quite like it done before in Canada. So it really gives us the opportunity to explore the sector in a way that we've never been able to before.
It's such a timely survey. I know in the work that we do at Imagine Canada, when I'm having conversations with the leaders of organizations, The health and well-being of the people who work for them is top of mind. Everybody is talking about labor market issues and labor force issues. So having this access to this kind of data is really, really critical. Steven, I'm going to come to you with a question around as we start to dig into really the findings. And one of the main findings of the study is the low job satisfaction in the nonprofit sector. I think this is probably a bit disconcerting to some who are employers, because the data shows that 26% of employees are expressing being unsatisfied with their jobs. And that's higher than the 19% in the private sector and the 17% in the public sector. So what does the study tell us regarding job satisfaction when we look more closely at different groups or categories of employees?
We didn't intend to start off writing a paper about job satisfaction. It's unfortunate that when we started to write the paper and dive into the differences, this became such a striking difference across so many different groups within the sector. And there is a lot of diversity. There's certainly a much larger percentage of folks who say they're unsatisfied with their jobs, but it does reflect a very large group that are satisfied, as well as these folks who aren't. And of course, the differences, when we start diving into them, they are pretty profound when you think about the differences and what they mean for folks. I mean, when we see all the sorts of things with what the association with job satisfaction, we see it is associated with lower quality of life overall, lower life satisfaction, more likely that someone's going to leave the job, having significant costs for employers. We look at what it means for communities. We see studies that have found that folks with lower job satisfaction are more likely to make mistakes at work, which is many folks work in social services or medical professions. These consequences can be real significant. And so what we want to understand is, what are the differences in terms of who's most satisfied and who isn't? One of the most striking differences we saw was the differences between those working in frontline service roles and those working in managerial roles. And the differences were staggering. And more than 40% of folks working in service roles reported they were unsatisfied with their jobs, compared to less than 20% of those working in managerial roles. And when we do talk about, even with a survey as large as this one, the sample sizes in some of these are small. So I think the differences in some of the magnitude of the differences are quite critical. Looking at some really specific groups that we've never had the opportunity to look at before, the exact magnitude should be interpreted with caution. But the differences, when we see such stark contrast, are quite critical. And of course, when we look at some of the other differences, like the folks who are most likely to be dissatisfied with their jobs, we see it's young people, it's newcomers to Canada, and first generation Canadians. And so those are folks who are reporting the lowest job satisfaction in the sector, which I think is particularly concerning, because when we talk about the job shortages in the sector, that really suggests that this is not just a short-term phenomenon, but it could be something that's going to be quite enduring. These are the folks the sector needs to be able to recruit and retain, to be able to be the workforce it needs to be for the future. And these are the folks saying that they're not enjoying their jobs. And if we don't figure out a way to solve that, it's going to ripple for a very long time. These folks are, of course, much less likely to recommend their jobs or their employers to their friends and family, which means it's going to be even harder when they're looking at people who might work in the same field. If someone's asking them, where should I work after? They're not going to be necessarily saying my employer is the place to go. And if that might mean a lot of folks who would otherwise be looking to take a job in the nonprofit sector might end up in a different sector when they're hearing some of the stories that they might hear, particularly from those working in some of the frontline work that is so critical to the success of the nonprofit sector.
And these are such important points around the future of the talent pipeline, because as we often talk about, this is a sector that is less likely to be replaced in terms of jobs by robotics or potentially even by AI. So ensuring that there's a robust talent pipeline is critically important. So Steve, I'm going to come to you with one more question before we pose one to Laura. We mentioned it earlier, precarious and part-time work is common in our sector. Workers in the nonprofit sector are much more likely to have temporary jobs compared to workers in other sectors. So 27% in our sector versus 13% of private sector workers and 17% of public sector workers. So nonprofit workers are also twice as likely to be working part-time as private sector workers. Again, the numbers are stark. 34% in our sector, 18% in the private sector, with about 2 in 5 part-time workers desiring full-time work across the sectors. These numbers are not necessarily surprising, but they're extremely concerning, especially as the study shows that they result in economic precarity. What are the findings regarding employment and economic precarity, and how can we interpret these findings?
Yes, one of the things that makes our findings particularly challenging, because when we do see some of the characteristics of the nonprofit sector, including contract work, involuntary part-time work, some of the factors around low pay, these are relatively difficult challenges to fix. There's certainly conditions in a workplace that might be easier for fix, but these aren't things that employers can easily adjust. Like there's a reason they aren't paying well, and it's often related to funding and the sort of conditions around it and the level of support they have. So it does really speak to a bigger issue in terms of the conditions under which organizations are funded, where they don't have adequate funds to be able to pay staff, are resulting in a whole bunch of different severe consequences for the employees. And of course, the leading to job satisfaction is certainly one of them. With the sort of sample sizes we have, we didn't really do a deep dive, particularly on like, is it part-time work or involuntary part-time work, or having multiple jobs, or is it the fact that you're on contract and you want a full-time permanent job? We didn't really understand which of these is the biggest factor driving both the job satisfaction as well as some of the results around economic precarity. But it's certainly that combination, particularly for newcomers, particularly for young people who might also have all sorts of other vulnerabilities as well that make those sorts of factors particularly challenging. If you're living in one of our major cities where your rent, especially if you're new to Canada, and you might be paying 3 times more for your rent than someone who's been here 20 years, and you also have a job that could end at any point and may be paying lower than a dozen other sectors. Like those sorts of factors certainly combine to a very challenging situation, both for someone's job satisfaction, but as well, like their overall life satisfaction, their mental health, their well-being. Like these are pretty drastic consequences. And it does, I think, speak to the need for funders of all sorts, whether it's government, donors, foundations, to think through how their policies might be contributing to that, some of those differences.
Yeah, the findings really do speak to a need for greater intentionality as we think about how we manage our people, how we attract and retain talent. So Laura, over to you. In 2022, Imagine Canada published the report Diversity is Our Strength, which showed how diverse the nonprofit workforce is. The Burden of Care report highlights this fact as well, confirming that our sector employs more women, racialized individuals, Indigenous people, individuals with disabilities, and people under 35 compared to other sectors. In addition to facing difficult working conditions, the study also shows that nonprofit workers are more likely to have faced discrimination and unfair treatment at work. Can you expand a bit on these findings for us?
Sure. So in the report, we see that these groups are more likely to face discrimination, which I think is somewhat surprising and kind of counterintuitive to what you might think is happening in the nonprofit sector, a sector that's, well known for being a little bit more advanced in terms of their equity, diversity, and inclusion policies than perhaps the private or the public sector. So that was a bit surprising to find that. But I would say across sort of the projects that we look at the Future Skills Center, this is happening across sectors and industries, kind of regardless of where you are in Canada. So it's not unique to the nonprofit sector. Our partners at the Diversity Institute have been looking at discrimination in the workplace, and they put out a report in 2022, which showed that we're actually seeing an increasing number of people perceiving that they are under or receiving unequal treatment at work. So Black peoples, Indigenous peoples, and again, people with disabilities, which came out really strongly in this report. When we look at across sectors, sort of there is this narrative going on about we have these labor and skills shortages, regardless of the sector or industry. This includes the nonprofit sector, where we're increasingly looking to these groups who have been marginalized historically in the labor market to fill some of those labor and skills shortages. And yet we're also seeing across industries and sectors the continued experience of discrimination. So we're seeing sectors like agriculture and trades and food and beverage manufacturing and the nonprofit sector all trying to attract these workers, all increasingly making statements and having strategies in place around equity, diversity, and inclusion, but we still see this continued experience. And so there's something missing in that pipeline, and it is somewhat surprising or counterintuitive to me that it's showing up more prominently in the nonprofit sector. That's a little bit surprising.
I'm going to come to both of you for a question here in terms of other findings. We've highlighted a few, but are there any other findings from the report that we haven't discussed that you'd like to highlight? And maybe Steve, we'll start with you.
One of the big things out of the report is the next step, which is how do we deal with the consequences of this, and like what can we actually do about it. And I think our report makes a lot of hints at suggestions, whether even the point we were just discussing around the discrimination that people face. That discrimination, for example, could be coming from people that are being served. It could be coming from coworkers. It could be coming from managers. But I do think like the broader point we have is things like equity benchmarks, or even surveying your own employees, surveying people when they're leaving the organization in exit interviews to understand why they're leaving, whether it was certain factors the organization has any control over. It really does speak to, when we look at a lot of the things that our results suggest, they do really point to the need for organizations to have these objective measures to be able to understand, like, are they doing well or not? And what are the areas specifically they can do something about? And when we look at things like particularly the gap between job satisfaction with managerial staff versus frontline staff, that can lead to some bias when people are trying to understand whether people like working for the organization, the issues why people are leaving. Because you have a bunch of folks who are reasonably satisfied, even compared to other sectors, who are making the judgments about what to do about these sorts of issues, but they're not the ones experiencing it. So when you look at these sorts of things like benchmarking, when you look at these sorts of tools like surveying or exit interviews, they can raise issues that might have been blind spots for organizations. Another thing, of course, when we talk about like what we can do about it, like we already talked before about the role that funders play, but when we see previously, Imagine published a report on unrestricted funding, one of the things that was particularly striking for me looking at that report was there's an example there of the Lyle S. Hallman Foundation, which shifted from having mostly restricted funding to having mostly unrestricted funding. And they did an evaluation of it. And they found that a lot of the folks that, when they had unrestricted funding, they were spending money on improving salaries, on improving training, on improving working conditions. And so they had no real understanding necessarily of what specific ways people were going to be leveraging that unrestricted funding. But they can see for organizations that they were well run, that were really prominent in their community, what they took and did with the money they got when unrestricted was investing back in their employees. And I do think like when any of the funders listening, whether it's governments, foundations, like it is the sort of realization, like, nonprofits in many cases are aware of these. They'd love to have more training programs. They'd love to have better staffing conditions, but they don't necessarily have the resources. So when people do have unrestricted fundings, or they are willing to make investments with the understanding it's going to go specifically to staff, there are a lot of things that we can look at that there can be opportunities. And of course, when we look at frontline staff as particular, like we see like why are frontline staff particularly likely to report poor job satisfaction? It's very likely low wages, part-time staff, sometimes having multiple roles at multiple organizations. But there's also, of course, the risk that many of them are experiencing precarious trauma at work, or experiencing circumstances that might need support. And some of these folks who might be part-time staff or contract staff might not have access to employee assistance programs or mental health supports, or they might not even have someone they can speak to when they are facing discrimination at work or some other challenges. So there are certainly some things that I think every organization can take and look at and think, maybe this could apply for my organization. I'll let Laura pick that question up too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned like the core funding is how I kind of think of it, and the limits that puts on organizations. So I think about this from the future skills perspective in two ways. One is that the funding that goes to nonprofits is often program based, which means you don't have that longevity or stability in those frontline roles. Their roles are attached to temporary program funding that, if the organization is really lucky, they get 3 years. And that doesn't set up those organizations to offer good quality of work for those frontline staff. The other aspect of that program-based funding is that from a skills perspective, it doesn't allow them to spend on investments in those frontline staff to cultivate them, to give them new skills and capacities to advance in their careers. And so, we did a series of projects on quality of work to understand what's changed in the last couple of years around quality of work. And one of the things that comes through really strongly in that research is that workers are getting the message that they need to embrace lifelong learning to remain relevant in today's workforce, but as well into the future. And so we haven't actually got the policy infrastructure yet to facilitate that. And the nonprofit sector is a really good case study of that, because the way we fund it, we're not prepping those frontline workers. We're not giving the leeway to those organizations to choose to make those investments in frontline workers, because that program money doesn't come with the ability to kind of invest in professional development for those workers, even though the workers themselves might be interested and aware and expect those learning opportunities to be a part of those roles. And we can see that happening kind of across sectors and industries, that employers are increasingly offering educational opportunities, but whether that's actually something that's possible for nonprofits to do, given the way that they're funding, is unlikely. The other thing that I wanted to come back to was specifically looking at the findings around workers with disabilities. Again, coming back to that quality of work series that we funded a couple of projects looking at the quality of work experience for workers with disability in different kind of regions. One in IT around workers with autism, and one around how workers with disabilities are experiencing gig work. And it's not dissimilar to the findings that we're seeing in the nonprofit sector. They're being pushed into this work. It's not necessarily their first choice, but that's where they are. And 48% of the group that was interviewed in one of the projects said that they were continuing to experience discrimination as gig workers in various roles. And so there was a draw for workers with disabilities to gig work, but ultimately they felt as though they were pushed into that industry. And so across sectors, workers with disabilities are having, I would say, a poor experience of work quality. And so it's not surprising to me that that experience extends to the nonprofit sector as well.
With workers with disabilities, it was certainly discouraging, not necessarily surprising, but discouraging that we didn't see better job satisfaction amongst workers with disabilities. In fact, when you're comparing to other sectors, like it was specifically worse in the nonprofit sector and opposed to better. And I think that was certainly something that I wasn't hoping to see, given, the particularly high prevalence of workers with disability working in the sector. But it does sometimes come back to, in many cases, these organizations don't have a lot of funding. So some of the accommodations that maybe workers in the public or private sector have been able to put in place, nonprofits may not feel like they have the budgets to accommodate, or they may not feel like they have the sort of the structures to accommodate. So it was something that among nearly every group we looked at, workers with disabilities in the nonprofit sector really stood out for having particularly low job satisfaction. And it was particularly discouraging given, it is one of the areas that is really overrepresented amongst the workforce.
Well, certainly 48% is almost 1 in 2 workers reporting challenges in that area. That's a number that's got to change. So we've spent our time so far talking about this report, and you've already highlighted the previous reports, which has given quite a body of knowledge or evidence. With our last couple of questions, we're gonna look forward a little bit. As it said in the report, in the current era of increased demand for services that nonprofits and charities provide, and continual worker shortages in many areas of the sectors that we serve, addressing the issues raised in this report will be key to the future vitality of the charitable and not-for-profit sector. You've both been working in this sector for a while, are seasoned professionals. So how do you see the trends in this report, those that are uncovered, how do you see them evolving? And Laura, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think from a skills perspective, the nonprofit sector and its workers are sort of essential to meeting labor market demand. So we need those nonprofits in this sector to help us resolve some pretty complex challenges that are on the horizon related to skills. Across projects that we see across the country, nonprofit organizations are at the heart of sort of the skills and training ecosystem, especially in the ways that they provide wraparound supports for the groups that I mentioned earlier that multiple industries are trying to target and bring into their workforce. To do that successfully, they need the support of nonprofits to address some of those systemic barriers that are in the way of those people being successful. And so without nonprofits, we're not going to solve those skills problems and meet those labor and skills shortages. In terms of how to improve conditions, I mean, we've kind of already spoken about long-term, sustained, predictable funding, giving organizations the leeway to make those investments where they need to.
Yeah. Steve, how about you?
One of the things that really is critical is we have measures now about the low job satisfaction. I think we need to understand a lot more about the characteristics of nonprofit work and have initiatives set up so we can track progress over time and see, if we're talking 5 years from now, there's nothing currently set up to be like, where are we now? Where do we want to be and how are we going to get there? So I think both like establishing measures that can allow us to understand, are we improving? Are we getting worse? And if we're implementing new initiatives, and I know Imagine Canada, ONN, and so many other associations and individual nonprofits across this country have been putting all sorts of effort and thinking into how we can do better. But there's really no way to capture whether we're making the progress we want to and holding ourselves accountable to make real progress. And I think that's a real critical measure when we look at how we're going to understand, did we make real progress on this initiative? And we can certainly track measures on an ongoing basis, like things like job vacancies or unfilled jobs at nonprofits. And a lot of those characteristics aren't improving in the way that we might like. And if we're going to understand like how we can get from here to there, I think we need to be both measuring on an ongoing basis, but also look at as a sector, like what are the initiatives we recognize that the vast majority of nonprofits should be working towards, and how do we make sure that they're being implemented, and that we can track over time that more and more folks are making some progress on some of these areas. Because if not, I suspect, 5 years from now, we'll just have more conversations about the precarity, the part-time works, the contract work, and all these other things. So I really think, making both the tools to make sure that we're making progress, and as well as, really identifying initiatives that are going to make progress is one of the key things that we need to do.
I just want to jump in here and come back to the finding around discrimination and what we need to do as a sector to move that further along is measures around how we're doing on EDI in the sector and authentically doing. So yes, audits are a good idea and measures, but how much progress we're really making as a sector to decrease discrimination in the workplace for the groups that we've identified in this report. I know that this is a priority for Future Skills looking across industries and sectors, but the nonprofit really has the potential to lead the way on what interventions on EDI at an organizational level or at a systems level really work and move us forward. And so there's an opportunity there for us to track and document the interventions that are really working and make sure that others understand this and that can benefit other sectors and industries who perhaps don't have that background knowledge that a lot of the nonprofit sector does.
So as we're talking about job satisfaction and talking about potential initiatives, one of the things that's been really interesting, and I've seen at reference a couple times in the news, is talking about Imagine Canada's 4-day work week. And obviously that's one really intriguing solution when we talk about job satisfaction and burnout in the sector. I was wondering, Bruce, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the results you've seen and some of the tracking you've done, what the outcomes have been of implementing that.
Sure. And this is a first with the podcast guest turning the tables on the podcast host and asking a question. But absolutely happy to speak to it. This is something we launched in 2023. We're continuing through 2024 and trying to assess the effectiveness of the 4-day work week. We created a 48 metric scorecard. And just some of the findings that we found were everything from, at the time we were measuring 100% staff retention after about 8 months. A drop in sick time of 40% compared to year over year, significantly higher job satisfaction and well-being scores from our staff measured in the first of the surveys. In addition, we were looking at performance. How are we tracking as it related to the work that we do? And I would say by and large, we were measuring the same, slightly better, and yes, slightly worse on some indicators. But when we dug deeper, the attribution was not there, that the cause of the weaker performance was the 4-day work week. So as we were looking at it, the fact that we had happier staff who were staying with us and feeling better about their experience while performing at approximately the same or slightly better level meant that we were going to continue this practice and see how it unfolded in the future. Because for us, the big question was talent retention, and what we're finding in our job ads, talent attraction.
I think that this also brings up, it calls to mind as well, coming back to that quality of work piece that, when we look at job ads before the pandemic and after the pandemic, we've seen a real increase in non-wage benefits, which includes things like more flexibility in the hours worked, flexibility of when they're worked, flexibility of where they occur, increasing benefits like health and dental, time off, learning opportunities, as well as fringe benefits. And so there's some opportunities there for organizations who, maybe increasing wages is not in the realm of possibility. There's an increasingly long list of things that nonprofits could look to to improve quality of work, like a 4-day work week, that contribute to better quality of work and subsequently better quality of life for the workers.
And I think it goes back to this question of intentionality in terms of nonprofit employers thinking about how they compete in the marketplace and provide best-in-class workplaces. And to your point, Laura, it's not always about financial remuneration. It could be a suite of offerings, including decent working competitive salaries, but that also include other things to ensure that the sector is well positioned to compete for talent.
And Bruce, you mentioned like a lot of positive indicators with very few negative indicators when you evaluate it and sort of the rigor behind the process. We talked a lot in this conversation about the role that funders play. Switching from 5 days to 4 days work week, I mean, I'm sure got a lot of reaction from funders. Like, I'm curious, like the sort of support you've seen, initially versus, now that you've seen results that, very concrete results that are very positive. Like, what have you heard from some of your funders when you sort of had these conversations about the shift that you were looking to make?
I would say by and large, as long as we're delivering the impact that the funders are investing in, there has been widespread support. I would not say necessarily universal support. There have been questions. And I think that is fair game. And I think it's incumbent upon us to demonstrate that we are ensuring that the work that we're doing continues to be both at a high quality and delivering the value that sector organizations expect. So it's been a process. And I think what's really great is even those funders that were expressing some concern, we've continued the dialogue and are re-engaging in some cases. So that's wonderful to see.
Well, thanks for indulging me by letting me ask a question.
So it's so interesting hearing about some of the findings from this study. And I would unfortunately characterize them as a bit concerning. It's another study that tells us that we've got to keep advocating for decent work practices to improve working conditions for individuals in our sector. We need funders and governments to take actions, especially on the side of providing core and unrestricted funding opportunities so that organizations are better positioned to offer quality employment to their workers. And to your point, Laura, that you've stressed again here, it's critically important that our sector, which employs so many people from racialized background, new Canadians, persons with disabilities, is doing more and more to ensure that our workplaces are more welcoming and providing more satisfaction to their employers. But I think what's also really interesting about this conversation is that we can move forward in part because of the reports themselves. And the fact is, data is informing these conversations. So from a research perspective, what's the role and importance of data to help improve working conditions in the nonprofit sector? And why do we need more data about our sector? So I know, Steve, you've been in the data field for a while. I'm going to start with you on this question.
Data is absolutely critical when we want to understand both where we are and where we're going. And I think a lot of people I've talked to you about this report, there was a real mix of surprise at the findings and a lack of surprise. And I think in both cases, I've heard it from some of them incredibly prominent people in the sector who've been working in it for 30, 40 years. And I've had reactions being like, I'm completely flabbergasted by this finding. And I've had other folks say like, this is the least surprising finding I ever heard. And I think the mix of hearing both of them really speaks to why data is critical. It provides us that evidence that everyone you can certainly, there's different pieces of a survey. You could be like, well, did it do this properly? And we can certainly debate that. But I think like it provides us that initial grounding of where are we at? And then I think as a sector, everyone would recognize this is not where we want to be. So it's where are we at and where are we going? And really, I think using these sorts of evidence-based practices to identify what could really make progress. And there's even with our survey we've conducted so far, like we really spent a lot of our time just clearly emphasizing the point, here's what job satisfaction looks in the sector. Here are the groups that are most affected. And we really wanted to make the point of like, there's some very concerning issues here. But even with what we've done, we're only scratching the surface of this is a gigantic survey that's conducted across 6 waves with different questions each time. There's really a lot more that can be leveraged and understood about the sector. And then when we look again at that longer term perspective, like 5 years from now, have we done better? Where are we at? And I certainly hope with similar surveys conducted 5 years from now or 3 years from now, we're starting to see us moving in the same direction, in the right direction, and not continuing to see these sorts of conditions. And particularly, I think like diving into those first generation Canadians, those younger workers, and really understanding, are we transforming the sector into a place where those folks want to work, want to stay, and spend their entire careers? Or are we remaining a thing where, this contract work is incredibly prevalent, the involuntary part-time jobs are incredibly prevalent. And we can measure all these things through surveys. And I think really having these sorts of ongoing measures of, the things that we know contribute to poor job satisfaction. And even in the conversation we've had so far, a lot of the questions that come up of let's say discrimination, how much is that causing job dissatisfaction? What initiatives could be implemented to make improvements? I think more work are trying to understand what specifically has worked well for organizations, and then trying to understand how, as we identify things that can work to help solve them, how are these being implemented across organizations? Where is it now, and where could it be? And how are funders, sectors, organizations like Imagine helping us get from here to there?
Great. And Laura, same question to you about the role and importance of data as we go forward.
Yeah, I'm going to come at this from a different angle just to not repeat what Steven has said, but there's also the aspect of coming back to skills again, of the organizations themselves needing to make investments in their ability to collect and use data to inform decision making. And so, one of the projects that we've got at the Future Skills Center is the Practitioner Data Initiative, and it's in collaboration with Blueprint, who's working with organizations, community organizations across the country to develop their skills to actually leverage their own data to understand what's happening, both in terms of their services, but both organizationally, to understand within an organization, what kind of quality of work are we offering to our frontline staff, and how can we use that data to inform and make better decisions to see better outcomes. And so there's that aspect of it as well.
Adding to my point, one of the things even that surveys like the Survey on Employment and Skills, they measure what sort of training people get access to, who doesn't get training, what training outcomes they get, what their perceived need for training. It also measures things like, do they have access to mentorship? And in both cases, we see when people get access to training, particularly the training that they're sort of really leading to skill development, when people get access to mentorship, we see higher job satisfaction. And, other things when we look at just even whether people have role clarity or whether their managers are providing them the tools and support they need. These are all things that can be measured, and we can see where the biggest gaps are and identify okay, let's say it's managers who or one of the biggest gaps we might see, or we see certain sectors where people might be working for small organizations and there's no obvious candidate for mentorship. Are there ways we can look at, getting mentors across organization, or just I think if we can start to identify some of the specific gaps where we aren't seeing enough, and things that we know increase job satisfaction, it does allow us to identify and track progress to see 5 years from now, have we gotten 10 years from now, have we gotten better on these things that we know improve job satisfaction.
So interesting. I suspect we could spend several episodes on this kind of data. And you can tell from the findings, there's still lots of work to do on multiple fronts to improve conditions for workers in charities and not-for-profit organizations. For those who might not be aware, there is a resource that's available to folks in the sector that I would like to highlight, and it's called hrintervals.ca. And I encourage leaders and managers to visit hrintervals.ca to access free tools and resources to help them perform HR-related tasks within their organizations and promote decent work practices. We know that most organizations don't have paid talent to manage their people, and hopefully this is a resource that can get them started. So, Laura, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and hopefully folks will go digging into those findings and figuring out how they can make changes in their own organizations. Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.